Our next speaker tonight is Barbora Batokova. Barbara is originally from the Czech Republic, but currently calls Pittsburgh her home. And as you're about to see, she is definitely an avid mushroom enthusiast and a photographer, excellent photographer. And even though she doesn't say it in her bio, I personally know she's a very talented cook too, because I've sampled a few of the dishes she's made over the years at the Western Pennsylvania Mushroom Club's big annual event, the Gary Linkoff Foray in North Park, Pittsburgh. The Western PA Mushroom Club is a large, very active club, much like our own, and I consider them to be our sister club. And Barbara has been their president since last year. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Barbara.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the wonderful intro, and thank you for having me. So I will get right to it because we have a lot to cover. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about some edible mushrooms of Eastern North America. Particularly, we'll talk about 10 species and their lookalikes so that you can learn how to properly identify them. So as Tom mentioned, my name is Barbora Batokova. Some of you may know me as Fungi Woman on Instagram, which is something that I started back in 2018 when I started to explore mushrooms here in Pennsylvania. And in 2018, I joined Western Pennsylvania Mushroom Club, and the learning just sort of all started. And I am now in my second year of serving as the president, which I really love. And in April 2024, I became a book author. But in my other life, I am a UX design manager at the Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. So kind of two different worlds that I occupy. So we'll look at 10 common edible species. Some of you may know all of these. Maybe some of you don't. So hopefully you will learn something new today. So the first one is chicken of the woods, Letipora sulphureus. A lot of people, even non-mycophiles, know about it because these bright polypores are just kind of screaming at you from really far away. They grow in overlapping fan-shaped brackets. They do grow on wood. And usually they kind of grow in two spurs in sort of early summer around June, and then back in October around the fall time. And they are excellent edibles, but it's important to cook them really well because some people do have gastrointestinal upset when they eat them, even if they are actually cooked well. So whenever you eat a new mushroom, it's really important to just try a little bit and see if it sits well with you, and then kind of eat more. So that's general advice for anything new that you're trying in the mushroom world. So chicken of the woods is fairly easy to identify once you kind of see it once or twice. And you can also compare it to some of these other polypores that are out there. But if you're looking closely, there really aren't that many lookalikes. One of them could potentially be the Dyer's polypore, which is not that common, I would say, compared to chicken of the woods. You also have the Berkeley's polypore, which is kind of fuzzy at the top, and they have very different pore surfaces if you sort of take a closer look. The other one that's really not that similar is the black staining polypore, and that one will, if you damage it, will stain black. So chicken of the woods doesn't really do that. So those are sort of your closest lookalikes, I would say. But again, chicken of the woods is an easy mushroom to identify if you're kind of looking at the growth habit, and then as well on the pore surface. That's kind of your main thing to look for. The other species are golden chanterelle. So this is the Cantharellus species. There's many different kinds of chanterelles. So I'm kind of grouping them generally as golden chanterelles. And they are one of the most versatile and delicious mushrooms you can find. They are pretty common. They are these like fleshy vase-shaped mushrooms. They range from yellow to orange, and they are terrestrial, mycorrhizal with trees. So they don't grow on wood. They grow on the ground because they need their mycorrhizal partner to grow. They usually grow from July to August, depending on, when we get the rain and when it starts to get warmer. And your biggest thing to look for is that they are smooth or slightly wrinkled on the underside. So they do not have gills. That is your number one identifying characteristics. They do not have gills. And they're also not hollow. When you slice them in half, they will sort of have this white flesh when you separate them. And often they smell of apricots. Some people can smell it, some people can't, but they're delicious, delicious. So your biggest lookalike is the poisonous jack-o'-lantern, but the jack-o'-lantern has a very different growth habit. So the chanterelles will sort of grow on the ground all scattered, while the jack-o'-lantern will grow at the base of tree stumps or old decaying trees. And the biggest thing is they are usually much bigger, although size is not, the biggest differentiating factor, but they have gills. So that is your biggest differentiator, sort of the underside when you flip the mushroom open, when you flip it over and you kind of look on the underside, and you can see that whether those are true gills or just kind of deep wrinkles. As you see sort of on the right, there are some chanterelles that can have very deep wrinkles, but you cannot easily separate the wrinkle from the mushroom, but you can do that with a gill. So that's something to try out, test it out, and then you'll be able to confidently identify a chanterelle from a jack-o'-lantern. There are a couple of other potential lookalikes, but they are also gilled. So the false chanterelle is a conifer associate, and it has true gills. Again, not wrinkles. You can see it has a very distinct stem as well. So not something that is easily confused with a chanterelle, but potentially, could be if you're kind of new and just coming in and trying to identify chanterelles confidently. The other one, the false chanterelle, is not known to be toxic. It's just generally considered inedible. The other one to know of, which is not really a lookalike, but I do like to mention it, are some orange webcaps. So Cortinaria species, they are poisonous, especially if they are in the Orellani group. It kind of sounds like a mafia group of mushrooms, and they are one of the most poisonous fungi out there. But this is mostly a concern in Europe. We have not, I'm not aware of like massive findings of these Cortinaria species here in North America, but it doesn't mean that they're not out there. So I just like to mention that. But again, they will have true gills, unlike chanterelles. Okay, white morel. So morel season is going to be coming up hopefully soon. Usually these awesome, delicious edibles come up end of April to about May, depending where you're at, but that's kind of generally they're a spring edible. And they also have to be cooked well to consume them because they are toxic when they're raw. So even though we consider this mushroom to be edible, this one has to be cooked particularly well, which is generally true for all mushrooms. You have to cook all mushrooms in order to safely eat them. There's only a few species that you can eat raw. They're generally the porcini, the beefsteak mushroom, and the button mushroom. Sometimes people will eat those raw on like a salad, but you shouldn't eat a lot of those because mushrooms generally have chitin in them, and that is hard to digest. So we have to cook them. And some mushrooms, like the morels, have toxins in them when they're raw, but these toxins get destroyed when you cook them. That is not true for all toxins. I just want to make sure that that is clear. But the morels have these toxins that are destroyed by cooking. So morels are very interesting looking. They're kind of good at hiding on the forest floor, but they have this pitted honeycomb cap that is tan or beige or buff, and they have these randomly arranged ridges, and they are hollow inside, which is your main IDing characteristics. So let's look at some of the lookalikes. So your white morel is the one you're probably looking for, and that one is completely hollow inside, and the cap will sort of be part of the stem. There is another morel that is Morchella punctipes, the half-free morel, and it's still a morel because it is hollow on the inside, but you can see that the cap is sort of extending out from the stem. But that's okay, it's still a morel. The false morels is a group of mushrooms in the Gyromitra genus. And those are not hollow on the inside. They will look like a cauliflower on the inside. So they are not hollow. So if it's not hollow, it's false morel. I often don't like to use common names because some false morels you can eat, Gyromitra species, but that's getting a little too complicated. So I encourage you to do some research on your own if you're interested in that. But generally, if you're looking for morels, they have to be hollow on the inside, and that is a morel. If it's not hollow, it is a Gyromitra or something else. The other species that is often talked about in relation to morels is Verpa conica, which is the thimble cap. And that one is almost hollow, but it will have this pith inside the stem. And those are, some people also eat those. They are generally considered edible, but they are, again, have to be cooked well. They're particularly popular in Europe, not so much here in Pennsylvania or in Eastern North America. Okay. Other species, hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa, is a popular choice edible mushroom that's been consumed for forever. It is a large clustered polypore that is composed of these tiny, tiny caps. It is delicious. It usually grows at the base of mature oaks. So going to parks, like old parks, is a really good place to look for these. And this is a fall mushroom. So look for them sometime end of September to October. And they will also kind of look cauliflower-like or kind of resemble a tree when you slice them in half. But careful when you forage these. Lots of insects try to hide, or not try, they hide inside this mushroom. So you got to make sure that you clean this one well. And there aren't really any lookalikes. The closest one I would say is, again, the black staining polypore. But again, the black staining polypore will stain black, whereas hen of the woods does not stain black. But black staining polypore is also edible. So if you find that one as well, it is a delicious edible. And some people even prefer it to like chicken or hen of the woods. So that's a good one to know as well. All right, common puffball. So this is an easy to identify edible mushroom that grows in great numbers. You can find it sort of in the woodlands. You can also find it in grass, like disturbed soil. And it generally grows from around August to October. And it is this kind of marshmallowy textured mushroom. It's kind of soft. You can kind of, when you squish it, it'll kind of spring back like a marshmallow, which is a really good way to differentiate it from earth balls. So those are also sort of round, spherically shaped mushrooms that grow in the woods. But the inside is very different. So when you have a puffball and it's in the edible stage, it will be completely white on the inside. Now, an earth ball will always have the spore mass on the inside already. So it will not be white on the inside. It'll be gray or dark gray. And then the other way to differentiate these species is sort of how they disperse the spores. So a puffball will have a central opening, whereas the earth ball will just kind of like split open in kind of a very, you know, different way. So, but at this stage, when you see there is an opening in the puffball, they're not edible anymore because the inside, the flesh, has already turned into spores. So at that point, it is not edible. So in order for you to forage puffballs safely, they have to be completely white when you slice them open. There is another puffball that is out there, the pear-shaped puffball, which is a little bit browner. It's not as white as the common puffball, but that one is also edible, and it usually grows on wood. It doesn't grow terrestrially. So, and that one is a bit more easier to confuse with an earth ball, but they grow in large numbers. So that's another good differentiator there. Okay, honey mushrooms. So honey mushrooms are a bit more tricky to identify. So this is not a beginner's mushroom, but there are ways to identify it, but it certainly takes time and seeing it in person because honey mushrooms can be very variable morphologically. There's multiple species as well. These are fall mushrooms, so look for them sort of in clusters. They grow in clusters in August through October, and they are saprobic and parasitic. So they're actually the most destructive pathogen in the world. So they will attack a living tree, and then eventually, so at that point, they are parasites. And then once they kill the tree, they will continue to decompose the wood, and they become saprobic in nature. So that is your honey mushroom. There are lots of lookalikes, which is why this mushroom is a tricky one to get to know well and forage for. So let's look at some of those. So your honey mushroom is the one on the left. It grows in clusters. So do all the other lookalikes. So your first one to know is the sulfur tuft, which is a conifer decomposing mushroom, but the gills are very different. They will sort of start to turn into this like poisonous greenish, purplish hue, unlike honey mushrooms. Brake caps are also another lookalike. They're not the greatest edibles, but some people will forage for them as well. But again, this is not a beginner's mushroom. You've got to know what you're doing in order to safely forage for these. Here you will notice that the spores are very dark, and they will start to kind of drop on the stem, and they will start to color the gills, and eventually the gills will turn completely brown. And finally, you have the deadly gallerina, also called the funeral bell, which is, I just love that name. It's used in the UK. And that one, the deadly gallerina and the sulfur tuft, if you're going to forage for mushrooms, my first advice is also always to get to know the ones that can kill you. And the deadly gallerina is one of those. So that one also grows on wood, sometimes also in clusters, but it can also just grow singly. And it has this ring zone on the stem. So this one takes a bit of practice to be able to differentiate honey mushrooms from some of the other lookalikes out there. Okay, hedgehogs are another one that are very easy to identify species. They are common edibles, and they are as good as chanterelles, I would say. Although they can wreak havoc in your basket a little bit because all these little tiny teeth like to break off and dirty up all your other mushrooms. So make sure you separate them in your basket if you do find these. They are, again, a fall edible mushroom growing from September to October, but I have found them in November as well. And they grow in conifer forests. So they are terrestrial, mycorrhizal with various coniferous species. They are sort of these light orange mushrooms, and they kind of stain a little bit ochre when you kind of touch them or damage the flesh. But yeah, delicious mushrooms. No lookalikes because they have these very distinct teeth on the underside. So they don't have pores, they don't have gills or wrinkles. They just have these teeth hanging off, which is a pretty unique reproductive structure in the mushroom world. Okay, wood ear. That is a winter mushroom. You can find that right now. It has a high nutritional value, but it doesn't really taste like much. So it's often added to dishes as a texture addition, and it's often used in Asian dishes, and you can actually buy this one dried in many Asian stores. So it is a jelly fungus, ranges kind of from reddish brown to black, and it does look like an ear, especially when you kind of flip it over, that can reveal the smooth sort of wrinkled surface that kind of resembles an ear. There are some lookalikes, but you don't have to worry too much because we're not aware of jelly fungi to be toxic. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't one that we will discover at some point that may be toxic, but as of right now, we're not aware of any. So your lookalikes here are the American Amber Jelly Roll, also called woodland raisins. These are very abundant, probably more abundant than wood ears out and about. But they are a bit more translucent than the wood ears. If you kind of hold them up against the light, you will sort of see the translucent nature of that fruiting body. And the other one, which is super cool, is the Phyllotrimella species. There's multiple species. And the differentiator there is they're also a bit more cloudy, like not as translucent as the Amber Jelly Roll, but it is parasitic, or there's some sort of association with Asterium species, which you can kind of see in the bottom right picture a little bit. So that can help you differentiate that as well. But mostly your differentiator is kind of the shape and general texture of the fruiting body. All right, red mouth bolete. So boletes are generally safe mushrooms to forage for. So those are the mushrooms that have pores on the underside. So it's kind of like if you were to minimize like a box of straws. That's what kind of pores look like. There are these like openings on the underside of these fleshy mushrooms. Red mouth bolete is one of them. It is very abundant, especially in Pennsylvania. And it is delicious, but it has some poisonous lookalikes, though that lookalike is not very common. So the red mouth bolete is terrestrial. It grows on the ground, and it is mycorrhizal with hemlock. And it usually starts to grow around June and continues until September. But some of the lookalikes are over here. So you have the Neoboletus subvelutipes, the red mouth bolete, which associates with conifers. There is a very close lookalike, which for a very long time was considered to be the same species. It's still a little bit of a taxonomic mess, but the general consensus is that if you find a red mouth bolete in an oak forest, it is not the true red mouth bolete, but it is a different species, so Boletus subluridelis. But it is also edible and also very good. Now, however, there is a lookalike that has been recorded in Pennsylvania, and there is one observation on iNaturalist from West Virginia of the Rubra boletus rhodosanguineus, the perfume bolete, which is part of the the bad boletes genus, the Rubroboletus, which has some of the toxic and potentially deadly poisonous boletes. So they are part of the red-pored blue stainer group, as they're sometimes called. And so again, if, you know, to the untrained eye, this can be a pretty difficult one to distinguish, but there is one characteristic you can rely on, and that is that Rubroboletus, the perfume bolete, and all the Rubroboletus species, I believe, have reticulation on the stem, which is this netting that covers the stem. The red-mouth boletes don't have that. Their stems are sort of smooth, or they're kind of covered in these like streaks or potentially like tiny little dots. But they will not have a netting. So they will not have this reticulation. So that's your biggest differentiator. But again, this is not a beginner mushroom by any means. Okay, and the wood bluet is also a cooler weather loving mushroom that can be a little bit tricky to identify, but again, can be easily learned once you see it once or twice, and if you see one of its potential lookalikes. So this one grows from about September through November, but you know, if it's a mild winter, can also grow in December, January. And it is a saprobic mushroom. So even though it looks like it grows on the ground, it is actually decomposing leaf litter. So it does not need a tree to grow. It's not mycorrhizal. Let's look at the lookalikes. So the biggest lookalike for the wood bluet are the web caps, the purple web caps that are quite frequent in our woods. But the way to distinguish them is that the web caps will have this tiny kind of veil that covers, kind of a cobweb-like veil that covers the gills. And that's why they're called web caps. And they will also have a rusty spore print. So you can see that in some of the pictures in the bottom row, either the ring zone is starting to turn orange, sort of rusty, or the gills are completely rusty brown already because the spores have dropped and they have colored the gills. The bluet has a whitish spore print. So if you're not sure and you pick up some purple gilled mushrooms and you're not 100% sure, you can do a spore print. And then if it's rusty brown, do not eat it. That is kind of your way. And then the other identifying characteristics here is the cap of the bluet will kind of become a little bit mottled or kind of will lose color. And then that is also a pretty good, characteristic. But again, you kind of have to see it and compare it to like other purple mushrooms out there in the woods or over the years to kind of know what that sort of feels like. And that's it. So if you want to know more, obviously there's a lot more information in my book on all of those species and more. And there's also a whole bunch of recipes for you to try.